Welcome back from the break. The Canada's Drug Agency Assessment Framework for Cancer Biomarkers represents a critical early step towards improving equitable access to biomarker testing across Canada. This next presentation will introduce the purpose and structure of the framework, highlighting its potential to guide more consistent, evidence-informed decision-making and system-wide coordination. We'll hear about implementation timelines, early priorities, and mechanisms for interprovincial collaboration, as well as opportunities for shared infrastructure, coordinated data access, and policy levers to enable broader uptake. We're very pleased to welcome Dr. Laura Weeks, Director of Health Technology Assessment at CDA. Following the presentation, we'll be joined by a multi-stakeholder expert panel who will reflect on and discuss the framework. So please make sure that you stay with us through the entire sessions here. Keep the questions coming in, again, just using the questions bar below the video stream, and we'll be hosting the Q&A session following the panel discussion. So a warm welcome to you, Dr. Weeks. I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Cassandra, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone joining the meeting today. As Cassandra has said, my name is Laura Weeks. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm very pleased to be here and have such a privileged spot on the agenda to share some work that we've been doing at Canada's Drug Agency to support more equitable access to biomarker testing. So I'm joining this meeting today from my home office with a little bit of a tickle, so I'm hoping that I don't cough too much during the talk, from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, about 80 kilometers west of Ottawa on the Tay River. By way of disclosure, I did want to say that Canada's Drug Agency is funded by Health Canada, in addition to the provinces and territories. We also receive application fees from the pharmaceutical industry for our drug reimbursement review program, as well as our scientific advice program. And I personally have no other relevant interest to declare. I thought I would start the talk with just a few words about who we are at Canada's Drug Agency and what our role is in the health system, just to level set a little bit. So for awareness, we're a pan-Canadian health organization. Our primary mandate is to provide evidence, appraisal, and advice to our health system leaders to help them make evidence-informed decisions about drugs and health technologies and broader health system strategies and investments. As I mentioned, we're funded by Health Canada as well as the provinces and territories. And so that's who we do our work for. They ask us questions and we provide them with evidence and information, convene partners, and engage just to help support their decisions. We have a 5-year strategic plan running from 2025 to 2030, and our core pillars are to support our health system partners to anticipate, innovate, and transform. Anticipate the needs of the future, balanced with the challenges impacting healthcare today. Innovate in response to the massive amount of innovation that's happening in health technology around us and in how we do our work in response. And then also to transform our health systems to ensure the best care for people in Canada with attention to alignment, reducing fragmentation, and supporting coordinated actions. All of the work that we do is guided by 5 guiding principles, helping us to produce high quality work that's responsive to the context in the areas in which we are working, developed in partnership with key interest holders, reflective of all people living in Canada, while also maintaining accountability for and transparency in how we do our work. And I hope that these principles show up in the work that we'll discuss together today. And so to that discussion, why we're here today, we're here in response to what's happening in healthcare, and one of the key tenets being the prominence of precision medicine. Precision medicine is here and offers great potential for people to benefit from therapies developed specifically for people with certain genetic profiles. And this is the future of healthcare. And we see signals all around us to indicate that Canada is now getting ready for this transition. We see large investments in the integration and implementation of precision health, for example, through the Canadian Precision Health Initiative. We know there is a growing global market. And at Canada's Drug Agency, this shows up for us because we see that about 1 in 5 drug reviews that come through for reimbursement recommendations. So these are the new novel medicines coming to market. These are targeted precision-based therapies requiring some type of associated biomarker testing to help identify who might be eligible for treatment or to otherwise guide treatment decisions. And so it's in this context that we hear from our jurisdictional partners that there are some challenges to getting from the current state to a state where value-based precision therapies are accessible to all equally across the country and in a timely and efficient manner. For example, the way that decisions are made around funding for precision-based drug therapies and those biomarker tests that are required to support access to those therapies are variable. We have a relatively well-defined system for supporting the approval and funding and access to drugs, but the parallel systems to support decision-making and access to the tests required to support access to those drugs, they're not always aligned, and they can vary substantially between and sometimes even within provinces and territories. In addition, to support access to precision therapies, we know that we require systems that are integrated and coordinated. And this is everything from the data and the research to understand the meaningfulness of test results, to the people to help interpret those test results, and coordinated funds to provide access to testing. And this all matters because as precision medicine grows, biomarker testing is increasingly used to inform and determine access to modern cancer therapies. And these variations can lead to inequities in who could benefit from precision oncology. The good news is that we have heard from our jurisdictional partners that they are interested in developing a more coordinated approach to reduce duplication and to help keep pace with precision oncology. And so with that, I'm going to move to describe some efforts that we have initiated at the organization in support of precision oncology. What I have here is outlined 4 main buckets of work that we have ongoing. The first is our testing procedure assessments. And this is where we produce targeted reports about the testing requirements in order to obtain access to new drug therapies. So here what we're trying to do is be sure that testing considerations are part of the conversations when required around drug reimbursement, access, and implementation. We've also done work to develop a consensus-based assessment framework to support decisions around the adoption and funding of testing for biomarkers, and that will be the focus of our conversation today, so more on that in a minute. But for awareness, we also conduct targeted evidence reviews and environmental scans when requested by the jurisdictions if they're in need of any evidence or analysis or advice. For example, we're currently working on some recommendations to support decision-making around DPD testing, deficiency testing for people who are eligible to start some chemotherapies. We're also conducting an overview of the Canadian landscape around direct-to-consumer genetic testing. Finally, I wanted to give a shout out to some other pan-Canadian organizations that we are working with our partners at CAPCA, the Canadian Association for Provincial Cancer Agencies, and CPAC, the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer. We've developed a community of practice that brings together administrators, lab experts, and oncologists across jurisdictions to share knowledge, identify common system challenges, and talk about how we can work together to address those challenges at a pan-Canadian level and through a more coordinated approach. I'll flag that the community of practice did have some input into the development of our biomarker assessment framework, and that'll be the focus of the rest of our time together today. So what's the gap we're trying to solve? Before we initiated work on this assessment framework, we began with an environmental scan to understand how decisions around the adoption of testing for specific biomarkers are currently made across provinces and territories. What we learned through this work is that biomarker assessments are conducted independently across jurisdictions with limited coordination. And really, this means that there is duplication of effort. We learned that the processes for assessments vary. Some jurisdictions have standing committees, some do not. There can be different payers for biomarker testing and the treatments that the test results are intended to inform. and sometimes different payers depending on the purpose of the biomarker. Again, through this work, we confirmed that this can show up as limited access, lack of timely access, or differential access to biomarker testing, depending on where somebody might live, which can limit access to the subsequent treatments. And so this is the space and some of the challenges that we were hoping to support through our work with the assessment framework. So in response to the challenges we heard in the space, we stood up a time-limited advisory panel who had the primary objective to develop this consensus-based assessment framework to help inform decisions around the adoption and implementation of testing for biomarkers in cancer care. They also had the goal to identify any best practices in jurisdictions, and if there were any that we might want to spread in scale to different jurisdictions, and also to provide us with some actionable implementation considerations for the framework. We didn't want the advisory panel to just come up with an assessment framework. We wanted to be sure that that framework could actually be moved or implemented into practice within the jurisdictions to support the challenges that we are trying to address. And here is the stellar panel of advisory panel members that we were able to pull together. Some of these might be familiar to you, and some might be in the audience today. And I really do want to express my thanks for their contributions to this work. They were the brains behind it, and we are simply the messenger. Overall, the panel had 15 members that included 2 observers from Quebec, all representing diverse expertise, roles, and perspectives from across the country. I did want to give a special call out and note that we were very grateful to have the participation of 2 patient representatives on the panel, Eric Hamilton and Robbie Spring, and really want to highlight the thoughtful perspectives that they were able to bring to the panel's work. Given the focus of this conference is on comprehensive genomic profiling, I did want to spend a minute just preempting some potential questions about our approach and our scope. So I will clarify that we used a biomarker by biomarker assessment approach. And so as such, the framework is not intended to support at this time broader decisions around CGP adoption. We did discuss this extensively with the advisory panel at the time and recognized that the shift towards multi-gene panels and comprehensive profiling that is happening. However, the panel noted that testing technologies, access, and implementation can vary considerably across jurisdictions. And our jurisdictional contributors emphasized that the framework should remain agnostic to how testing is actually implemented, for example, whether through single gene or multi-gene panels. And so based on that feedback, we did focus our work with the biomarker as the core decision unit. And this allowed us to separate the evidence review from the implementation of testing and give jurisdictions some flexibility in terms of how to adopt the approaches to testing that fit within their local context. I will say that as evidence evolves and as we move forward and gain experience with the framework, it is possible that the framework itself can also expand to be able to support broader types of adoption decisions. Here, just wanted to show the process that the advisory panel went through to develop the framework, beginning with a series of meetings in February of last year to confirm the scope and do the hard work to develop the proposed assessment criteria and processes. We also held information sessions for a range of different interest holders, including industry, patients and patient groups, and clinicians and clinical societies. We had an open call for input on a draft version of the framework over the summer months of last year, and quite honestly, we're overwhelmed by the amount of thoughtful input that we received. And of course, I want to give out a shout out to CRAN for their efforts in pulling together at least 13 different patient groups to provide a consolidated piece of feedback for us to consider, which was extremely valuable as we moved forward with our work to really help ensure that it reflected the needs, the opportunities, concerns, challenges, and identified by patient representatives. The framework itself was published last month. It's now available on our website in both official languages. And we also developed a longer version and a shorter version, summary version of the framework. And now our focus is on dissemination and implementation, and I will move to that in a bit. First, and I mentioned this on the last slide, that we did have a public feedback period last summer. But what I did want to share with this group for transparency and awareness is that all of the feedback that we did receive, including the great feedback by CRAN, is available on our website. So if you are interested to see the feedback that we received and consider how that might have influenced our final product, please go check it out. Here, I wanted to highlight some of the major themes that we heard during the input period from patient groups in particular. Overall, the feedback emphasized patient partnership, equity, and timeliness as key priorities. We heard that there's a need to be inclusive of patient voices across the full spectrum of assessment, and ensure that this includes a focus on people with lived and living experiences and also underserved populations and Indigenous voices. We heard that the inclusion of health, justice, and equity is as a guiding principle and a core evidence criterion is important, though there can be a risk to this remaining symbolic. And so we were challenged to hold ourselves to account by developing a system to collect data to measure progress with a focus on equity metrics, such as wait times by region or test uptake by different demographic groups or geographic location. We also heard that timeliness is key, and despite good intentions to support consistency across jurisdictions, we can't delay or be a barrier to patient access to timely testing. We heard of the need for transparency in processes, timelines, and decisions. And this could be publishing timelines and the status of submissions, in addition to recommendations and rationales. And really hearing that the move towards a publicly facing resource to detail which tests are performed or funded and where. We also heard the need for support for patient groups, and not just that support is needed, but what that support could look like. For example, developing plain language templates and guidance, training sessions to navigate the intake process, and advisory support through the more technical aspects of an intake submission. And then finally, what I'll highlight is that we heard about the rapidly evolving treatment landscape and the importance of refining our assessment practices in response. So here again, signaling the move towards CGP and also the emergence of targeted therapies and drug for rare disease. I want you to know that this feedback did help to shape the final version of the framework, and where we were able to consider these elements and embed meaningful partnership, a focus on equity, and the need for timeliness across key components of the framework. We also know that there are some areas that we can continue to work on moving forward, including, as I have alluded, outlining specifically what structured support for patients, patient groups might look like at intake, and also how equity, for example, can be measured in practice. Here you can see what the reports actually look like in both English and French. The advisory panel did focus on 4 key components. So these are the guiding principles, a biomarker identification and intake process, evidence criteria and assessment processes. And then the reports also include a series of non-binding recommendations to support the implementation of the framework and promote greater consistency and transparency in terms of biomarker adoption and implementation decisions. And I'll walk through each of these briefly. So first, in terms of the guiding principles, these are the 4 that were put forward by the advisory panel, intending these to reflect the goals and the values health systems aim to achieve relevant to biomarker assessment. So the panel used these principles to both inform and shape the development of the framework itself, as well as the recommendations for future development. So here we see that the panel recommends that we be guided by the principles of responsible resource stewardship and sustainability, here to help ensure the responsible use of public resources by balancing public investment with potential benefits, including health outcomes for patients, as well as value for health systems. To uphold the principle of transparency and accountability, to promote effective, reasonable, transparent, and accountable decisions. Health justice and equity, to promote equitable opportunities to achieve health and well-being through biomarker testing. And collaboration, cooperation, and engagement to help build and foster trust and reciprocity amongst health system partners. Key component of the framework is the development of a standardized centralized intake process to help determine which biomarkers should be assessed as part of the process. Here, the panel proposed a centralized intake mechanism and committee that could enable a broad range of health system partners to submit biomarkers assessment requests. They recommend standardized submission forms to support consistent information gathering, along with a structured prioritization process using criteria such as system needs, evidence availability, and potential impact on patient care and outcomes or other criteria. And then finally, a process that distinguishes between companion and non-companion diagnostic biomarkers, with companion diagnostic biomarkers proposed to be assessed alongside their associated drug in an effort to better align funding recommendations for the drugs and the tests required to support their access. In terms of the evidence criteria to guide the assessment, the panel recommends a standardized set of 7 evidence criteria, 4 core criteria and 3 cross-cutting criteria. So the 4 core criteria are what you see in the vertical bars: the clinical utility, analytic validity, clinical validity, and ethical and social implications. And these being used to inform whether information about biomarker status provides meaningful clinical benefit, is analytically sound, and considers ethical and social implications. The 3 cross-cutting criteria in the horizontal bars: harms, equity, and the perspectives and preferences of patients, caregivers, and the public. These criteria were consistently identified as important, like within and across the core criteria, and were therefore proposed to be integrated throughout an assessment. And then I mentioned that the panel developed a set of 14 non-binding recommendations to support a phased adoption, implementation, and uptake of the framework within jurisdictions. Basically, the crux of the recommendations was to first encourage responsible partners within each of the jurisdictions to adopt the various elements of the assessment framework, and then looking ahead to consider working towards more of a pan-Canadian coordinated approach using the framework to support reducing unnecessary duplication, enhancing coordination and consistency. And this is where we are today. So at Canada's Drug Agency, we are responding to a key recommendation from the advisory panel to support proof of concept exercises for a centrally coordinated assessment model with interested jurisdictions. And that's where I'm going to spend the rest of my time in the talk today, is to provide a status update in terms of where we are at with these proof of concept exercises. And very pleased to say that most jurisdictions are involved in this exercise together and with us, with representation from all jurisdictions who currently have a similar decision-making process within their jurisdictions, as well as Quebec, who is participating as an observer to help ensure alignment between any pan-Canadian activities and the processes that they already have established within Quebec. So here's just a schematic of overall where we're going with the proof of concept exercises. So at a very high level, the work that we are doing will move through 3 different phases. First, we at Canada's Drug Agency will conduct an evidence review of 2 candidate biomarkers based on the 7 criteria outlined in the assessment framework. From there, we have an expert committee, our Health Technologies and Systems Expert Committee, or HITSEC. So HITSEC will develop recommendations for or against adoption of these biomarkers based on the CDA AMC assessment. And then those recommendations will go to the jurisdictions, who have the autonomy, of course, to implement or not the recommendations and any related biomarker testing if appropriate. So as I mentioned, we are running 2 assessments. One is on HRD, or homologous recombination deficiency testing for ovarian cancer, and the second is on MRD, or minimal residual disease testing for people with multiple myeloma. So HRD, it's a composite biomarker that indicates the impaired ability of cancer cells to repair damaged DNA, and its presence may influence treatment decisions, for people with these types of cancers. And so, because we hear that there might be a difference in outcomes for people who are HRD positive or not. MRD, this refers to a measurable amount of a small number of persistent cancer cells that can remain even after treatment. And in multiple myeloma, we know that MRD testing has the potential to guide treatment decisions, including whether someone may be able to safely discontinue treatment. And so we chose these two topics through a nomination and voting process with our jurisdictional partners. We proposed a set of candidate biomarkers, they added others, and then they voted. And these are the two that rose to the top. And so we take this as a sign that there's uncertainty across the jurisdictions about whether or not these biomarkers should be adopted into practice. So for context, when we conduct evidence reviews, we typically consider several domains. So clinical considerations, economic considerations, ethical and social considerations, and we also engage extensively with patients, clinicians, and industry. We have mapped these criteria to the criteria outlined in the biomarker assessment framework, and note that each criterion aligns to one or more of the evidence gathering and assessment practices that we are following. So for example, for the clinical domain that you see here on the screen, from the assessment framework, the criteria of clinical validity, clinical utility, and analytical validity will feed into this clinical domain. I wanted to provide an overview as well of our engagement strategy, both for awareness, but also to invite participation where it might align with the interests of people joining the meeting today. So I have separate slides upcoming covering patient and caregiver engagement, clinician engagement, as well as industry engagement. So I'll start with patient and caregiver engagement. And here we are using several different approaches. First, we did have an open call for input through our website, and we used a set of standardized questions to gather information around the impact of test results on daily life and quality of life, experiences accessing tests and treatments, any potential out-of-pocket costs, as well as experiences and interactions with the health system related to testing. We also wanted to build on feedback that we had previously received from patient groups on related topics and other parts of the organization, for example, through our drug reimbursement review program. And so here what we did is we reviewed past submissions from ovarian cancer groups, for example, for HRD, and developed a narrative summary of that input, which will be provided to our expert committee to inform their recommendation development. And this was also used to guide a focused conversation in the case of HRD with Ovarian Cancer Canada to allow them to refine and add any HRD specific input to the input that they had previously provided to the organization. We will also be including a person with lived experience as a specialist member on our expert committee who will develop recommendations. So we will invite this person to share their personal story with ovarian cancer and HRD testing and support the committee by responding to any questions they might have as they try to learn about the problem area and help to interpret the evidence that we present to them. And then finally, we will have an open call for input on the draft recommendations once they are developed, and certainly encourage interested parties here today to participate in that call when those recommendations are available. For our clinician engagement strategy, we have likewise posted an open call for input. So this was open for 3 weeks also, ending on June 10th. Similarly used a set of standardized questions asking for input around the goals of testing, unmet needs, any distinct social and ethical considerations, out-of-pocket costs that they believe may fall to patients, their families, and their caregivers, and any anticipated impacts for health systems. We've also invited clinical experts to be part of the review team to support the validation of the scope of the work, as well as to help interpret the evidence. Likewise, we'll invite clinical experts to be specialist members on our expert committee to help understand the clinical area and help interpret the evidence that's available. And then, of course, the open call for input on the draft recommendations. Of course, we will also invite any input from clinicians and clinical groups. And then last, and certainly not least, we're moving forward with an approach to industry engagement. In this case, we're also hosting an open call for input, and this will be a 2-week input opportunity and actually launched today. So this will be open for 2 weeks, and here we're asking 2 broad questions. First, whether they are aware of any evidence they believe that we should be considering within our review, And then an open-ended question if there's any other additional information they would like us to know to take forward into our assessments. And then, of course, industry is also invited to submit input through the open call. The one thing I did want to note on this topic as well is that here, industry does include drug manufacturers, but as well as manufacturers of any testing assays or platforms that may be involved in supporting access or testing for the particular biomarkers under review. Here, what I've outlined, so far is our evidence assessment approach, informed by the criteria and the assessment framework. And then looking ahead to develop recommendations, this is sort of a schematic of what that process looks like. So this is a publicly available document on our website and includes 3 phases of recommendation development: the input, the throughput, and the output. The evidence assessment and the report that we will produce at CDA, that's the input into this process, which is then forwarded to the expert committee who deliberates on that evidence in this throughput phase, and then develops a recommendation for against adoption of the candidate biomarker. And then following these deliberations, there's a recommendation report that is the output that outlines the committee's decision along with supporting rationale and key recommendations. And so this report is the key deliverable of this output phase, and that's what will be shared with the jurisdictions to help inform their decisions around adoption and implementation. And then again, it's up to the jurisdictions to decide whether to implement the recommendation based on their local context. And last, just briefly for awareness, I wanted to draw attention that in addition to the standard recommendation development process that our expert committee follows, as part of that process, they also have a common deliberative framework that includes 5 domains of value. So clinical value, unmet need, distinct social and ethical considerations, economic considerations, and impacts on health systems. And again, we've mapped these to the criteria proposed by the advisory panel and can confirm that the evidence criteria do align to one or more of the committee's deliberation domains. So these are the domains that the expert committee will use to guide their deliberation and develop recommendations for or against adoption. Okay, and then what's next? So before closing, I'm just going to briefly summarize what's next in case you want to follow along as we move through these proof of concept exercises. So both of our proof of concept exercises are in progress. Our HRD review began in April, and we are aiming for recommendation development by the expert committee in October, aiming to have the final recommendations and a final report available in December. For the MRD review, we just launched it this month, aiming for recommendation development by the expert committee in November, followed by an open call for public feedback, and the final recommendations anticipated to be ready in January. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your time and attention. And I think we'll be moving on to the next section of the agenda, which will include a conversation with different interest holders in this work. And I'm really looking forward to this part of the conversation because I know we're going to learn lots from hearing these different perspectives that we can bring back to the organization and inform our work moving forward.